The phone rang at 7:42 a.m. on a Tuesday that would end with handcuffs and federal charges. I was sitting in my pickup outside Patriot Steel and Manufacturing watching the morning shift clock in when Agent Patricia Hayes from the DoD Inspector General's office delivered the news that would change everything. "Mr. Crawford, we've detected irregularities in your defense escrow accounts. We need to talk today." I'd been expecting that call for 3 weeks, ever since our 31-year-old CEO, Austin Pemberton, decided federal regulations were more like suggestions, and his 24-year-old sister, Chloe, thought compliance meant posting about it on social media. "My name's Bill Crawford. I'm 57 years old, been keeping the books straight at this Detroit steel plant for 15 years. Before that, I spent 2 tours in Vietnam making sure Uncle Sam's money didn't disappear in some jungle. My wife Martha used to say I was born to count other people's money and make sure they didn't steal it. She passed 4 years ago, but I can still hear her voice every time some corporate hotshot thinks the rules don't apply to them. I'll be here all day, Agent Hayes," I told her, "and I've got everything documented. Everything. Every email, every transfer, every signature Austin had scrawled on compliance forms he never bothered to read. 3 banker's boxes worth of evidence sitting in my locked filing cabinet, plus duplicates stored off-site. When you've survived federal audits in a war zone, you learn that paperwork is your best friend, and backup copies are your insurance policy." I hung up and stared at the factory entrance. Patriot Steel had been building components for American fighter jets and naval vessels since 1958. Austin's grandfather started this place with a handshake loan and a commitment to never compromise on quality. Austin's father expanded it into one of Detroit's premier defense contractors, employing 400 workers who built parts that kept our military running. Now Austin was gambling it all away with what he called innovative resource allocation strategies. The trouble started 8 months ago when Austin took over as CEO. Fresh out of his MBA program, full of buzzwords about digital transformation and operational agility. His first move was bringing in his sister Chloe as digital strategy coordinator, which was fancy talk for putting a 24-year-old in charge of financial communications. His second move was deciding that $4.7 million in restricted defense funds would look better in his strategic flexibility account. I walked into the plant and headed straight to my office. The morning shift was already running, the steady rhythm of American manufacturing that had been the heartbeat of this country for generations. These weren't just jobs, they were careers that fed families, paid mortgages, sent kids to college. My own grandson Tommy was hoping to work here someday, following in his grandfather's footsteps. Austin's office door was open, as usual. The kid believed in transparent leadership, which mostly meant everyone could see him watching TikTok videos during business hours. He was leaning back in his chair, feet up on the desk that used to belong to his grandfather, scrolling through his phone like he was waiting for someone to entertain him. "Morning, Austin," I said, knocking on the doorframe. He looked up with that $1,000,000 smile that had charmed his way through prep school and business school, but wouldn't fool a federal investigator. "Bill, my favorite numbers guy. What's the damage report today?" That's how he talked about our financial reports, like they were weather updates instead of federal compliance documents that could land him in prison. "Actually, I wanted to ask you about the Q4 defense contract report you filed last week." Austin's smile flickered. "What about it?" Line 23B shows a $4.7 million transfer from Project Ironclad escrow to operational reserves. That transfer happened October 15th, but there's no authorization signature, no compliance memo, and no DoD approval. The smile disappeared entirely. Austin swung his feet down and tried to look serious, but he had the attention span of a caffeinated teenager. "Look, Bill, I appreciate the old-school approach, but we're streamlining operations here. The money's still there, just in a more agile configuration." Agile configuration. That's what he called stealing from the Defense Department. "Austin, that escrow account is ring-fenced for Project Ironclad. DoD regulations require complete segregation of those funds. Moving them without approval is a federal violation." He waved his hand like he was swatting away a mosquito. "It's just an accounting adjustment. We needed liquidity for the digital transformation initiative, bringing this place into the 21st century. Digital transformation." Austin's favorite excuse for every questionable decision he'd made since taking over. He'd already blown $800,000 on software that was supposed to revolutionize our inventory management, but mostly just made simple tasks unnecessarily complicated. "The money's still there," he repeated, turning back to his phone. "Just talk to Chloe about the presentation format. She's got everything under control." That's when I knew Austin was finished. Not because he'd stolen $4.7 million from a federal defense account. That was just regular stupidity. Austin was finished because he'd put his sister in charge of documenting the evidence of his crimes. I walked back to my office and pulled up my computer. Time to see exactly how much rope Austin had given himself to hang with. The compliance monitoring system showed Austin's digital signature on 3 separate Section 302 certification forms in the past month. Each form personally guaranteed the accuracy of every financial statement, under penalty of federal prosecution. Each form certified that all Defense Department funds were properly segregated and accounted for. Austin had just lied to the federal government in writing 3 times. And somewhere in this building, his sister was probably turning that lie into a PowerPoint presentation. I didn't have to wait long to see how bad things really were. At 11:23 a.m., my computer pinged with a new company-wide email from Chloe Pemberton. Subject line, "Exciting Q4 performance update." The email was everything I'd feared and more. Bright graphics, emoji explosions, and corporate buzzwords that would make a marketing intern cringe. But buried in all that digital nonsense was a complete confession to federal fraud, written in cheerful bullet points and shared with everyone who had a patriotsteel.com email address. Team, super excited to share our innovative resource allocation success story. She'd included an infographic that looked like it belonged on Instagram, showing money flowing from legacy constraint accounts to dynamic growth engines. The numbers were all there. $4.7 million moved from Dusty Defense Escrow to Strategic Flexibility Fund. She'd basically posted their criminal conspiracy on social media and sent it to 400 employees, plus our DoD compliance officer, our external auditor, and 3 board members who still remembered when corporate governance meant something more than good vibes and rocket ship emojis. My phone rang immediately. Linda Morrison from Compliance. "Bill, please tell me you're seeing this." "Reading it right now, Linda." "That transfer she's celebrating like it's her birthday party. That's from the Ironclad Escrow, isn't it?" "Yes, ma'am. Ring-fenced DoD funds moved without authorization." Long pause. In the background, I could hear Linda typing furiously. "Bill, this is a Section 302 violation with documented intent. Federal exposure. How long before the next audit?" I checked the compliance calendar hanging next to my Purple Heart citation, a gift from Martha when I started this job. 6 days. DoD audit team arrives Monday morning. Sweet Jesus. I understood the sentiment. When federal auditors find a $4.7 million discrepancy in defense contractor accounts, they don't just write it up as a finding, they write it up as a criminal referral. The beautiful thing about Section 302 was that I'd helped design it back in 2019 when we were updating our DoD compliance framework. Most people saw it as boring paperwork. I saw it as a legal landmine for exactly this kind of situation. Section 302 wasn't just about accurate reporting, it was about personal accountability. When you signed those certification forms, you weren't just saying the numbers were right. You were personally guaranteeing that every dollar was properly allocated according to federal law. And if it wasn't, the penalties weren't corporate fines that get paid by insurance companies. They were federal charges that get paid with prison time. Austin had signed 3 Section 302 forms in the past month, personally certifying that all Defense Department funds were segregated and accounted for. Now his sister had just broadcast proof that he'd been lying on federal documents while moving restricted military funds to pay for his digital transformation fantasy. I spent the next hour printing hard copies of everything, not just Chloe's confessional email, but the complete paper trail. Transfer authorizations with Austin's digital signature, Section 302 certifications under penalty of perjury, compliance reports showing the violations, and email chains where Austin discussed optimizing the escrow accounts. 3 complete sets. 1 locked in my filing cabinet, 1 in my truck, and 1 heading to my safety deposit box at First National. When you're dealing with federal regulations and family dynasties, redundancy isn't paranoia, it's survival. I'd learned that lesson in Vietnam when backup communications saved my unit from an artillery strike that wiped out our primary command post. Martha used to tease me about my filing systems. "Bill, you keep better records than the Library of Congress," she'd say. But she understood why. Growing up in Detroit during the auto industry collapse, we'd both seen what happened when good people trusted the wrong leaders. Companies disappeared, pensions evaporated, and families got left with nothing but promises that weren't worth the paper they were printed on. I wasn't going to let that happen to Patriot Steel. Not on my watch. Around 2 p.m., Austin called an impromptu staff meeting. Probably wanted to do damage control after his sister's email had half the company asking questions about money they didn't know was missing. He stood at the front of our main conference room, wearing a $500 suit that cost more than most of our welders made in a week, trying to explain strategic resource optimization to people who built fighter jet components with their hands. "Look, team, I know Chloe's update might have raised some questions about our fiscal management approach," he said, using the tone of voice you'd use to explain why the ice cream truck was out of popsicles. Ray Henderson, our shop foreman and a 30-year veteran of this place, raised his hand. "Austin, is it true you moved money out of the defense accounts?" "It's more nuanced than that, Ray. We're maximizing liquidity across our operational portfolio." Ray looked confused. Most of the room looked confused. When you've spent your career building things that protect American soldiers, corporate doublespeak doesn't translate well. "But the money's still there, right?" asked Janet Torres from Quality Control. "For the workers' pension contributions?" Austin hesitated just long enough for everyone to notice. "Of course. We're just using more flexible accounting structures." That's when I knew the dominoes were about to fall. Austin wasn't just stealing from the Defense Department. He was gambling with his own employees' futures, and he was too arrogant to realize he'd already lost the bet. My phone buzzed with a text message. "Agent Hayes, can you meet at 4 p.m., Federal Building downtown? Bring documentation." I texted back, "On my way. Time to show the federal government exactly what Austin Pemberton had been doing with their money." The Federal Building in downtown Detroit looked like it was built to intimidate people, and it worked. Gray concrete, small windows, and the kind of security that made you remember this was where serious business got handled. I walked through the metal detectors carrying a briefcase that contained 15 years of meticulous record-keeping and enough evidence to put Austin Pemberton in federal prison. Agent Patricia Hayes was exactly what you'd expect from a DOD investigator. Sharp suit, sharper eyes, and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent years dealing with people who thought they were smarter than federal law. She led me to a conference room that smelled like coffee and consequences. "Mr. Crawford, thank you for coming in. I understand you've been tracking some irregularities at Patriot Steel." "Yes, ma'am. And before we start, I want you to know I've got complete documentation going back to when Austin Pemberton first started making changes." I opened my briefcase and began laying out the evidence like I was setting up a military briefing. Martha always said I had a gift for organization, probably came from years of keeping supply manifests straight in Vietnam, where a missing decimal point could mean soldiers going without ammunition. First, the Section 302 certification forms, with Austin's digital signatures dated and time-stamped. Agent Hayes examined each one carefully. He personally certified the accuracy of these financial statements 3 times in the past month. Each form carries federal criminal penalties for false statements. Next, the transfer authorizations showing the $4.7 million movement from Project Ironclad escrow to Austin's strategic flexibility account. The timestamps showed the transfers happened within 48 hours of Austin signing the compliance certifications, so he moved restricted defense funds immediately after certifying they were properly segregated, Agent Hayes noted, making notes in a file that was getting thicker by the minute. "Yes, ma'am. And here's the documentation trail showing his sister broadcast the details to the entire company." I handed over printed copies of Chloe's email, complete with her cheerful infographics celebrating the resource reallocation success. Agent Hayes read it twice, then looked up with an expression I recognized from my military days, the look of someone who'd just realized the enemy had walked into a perfectly laid ambush. "Mr. Crawford, in your professional opinion, did Mr. Pemberton understand the legal requirements he was certifying?" "Agent Hayes, I wrote the training materials for Section 302 compliance when we updated our procedures in 2019. Austin attended the mandatory training sessions. He signed acknowledgement forms confirming he understood the personal liability involved." I pulled out another folder, training records, attendance sheets, and Austin's signature on documents titled Personal Criminal Liability under Federal Compliance Regulations. He knew exactly what he was signing, I continued, and he did it anyway. Agent Hayes leaned back in her chair. "Mr. Crawford, I have to ask, why didn't you stop this before it got to federal investigation level?" That was the question I'd been expecting. The one that got to the heart of what this was really about. "Agent Hayes, I tried the proper channels first. I flagged the discrepancies to our legal department. No response. I reported concerns to HR. They told me it was just budget season stress. I even sent compliance warnings to our external auditors. I showed her the email trail. Warnings ignored, concerns dismissed, and a systematic pattern of Austin's people freezing out anyone who questioned his innovative approaches. Austin wasn't just breaking federal law, I said. He was dismantling every safeguard I'd spent 15 years building to protect this company and its workers. When you're dealing with someone who thinks regulations are suggestions, sometimes you have to let them hang themselves with their own rope. Agent Hayes nodded slowly. And the Section 302 clause was the rope. Yes, ma'am. I helped design it specifically to catch this kind of fraud. Austin triggered automatic federal enforcement the moment he certified false statements about restricted defense funds. She closed the file and looked at me directly. Mr. Crawford, this is one of the most thoroughly documented compliance violations I've seen in 20 years of federal investigation work. Your records are going to make prosecution very straightforward. That was the idea, Agent Hayes. As I walked back to my truck, Detroit's afternoon skyline reminded me why this mattered. This city had been built by people who understood that integrity wasn't negotiable. Assembly line workers, steel workers, and veterans who came home and built the industrial backbone of America. Austin represented everything that was wrong with modern corporate culture. Entitlement without accountability, innovation without ethics, and profits without principles. My phone rang as I reached the parking garage. Unknown number. Mr. Crawford, this is Rebecca Shaw, reporter for the Detroit Free Press. I understand there's been some kind of federal investigation launched at Patriot Steel. Would you be available for comment? Word was already getting out. In a city like Detroit, where manufacturing jobs were sacred and corporate scandals hit close to home, this story would spread fast. No comment at this time, I said, but you might want to check the federal court filings tomorrow morning. I hung up and sat in my truck for a moment, looking back at the federal building. Inside that gray concrete fortress, the wheels of justice were turning with the inexorable precision of a well-maintained machine. Austin had no idea what was coming, but I did. Tomorrow morning, federal agents would arrive at Patriot Steel with search warrants and seizure orders. Austin's computers would be confiscated, his accounts frozen, and his future reduced to whatever deal his lawyers could negotiate with prosecutors who now had overwhelming evidence of deliberate federal fraud. The trap was set. All that remained was watching it spring shut. The federal agents arrived at Patriot Steel at exactly 8:00 a.m. Wednesday morning, 3 black SUVs rolling into our parking lot like a military convoy. I was already at my desk, coffee in hand, watching through my office window as Agent Hayes stepped out with a team of investigators and a stack of search warrants thick enough to choke a horse. Austin's BMW was in its usual spot, the one marked CEO that his grandfather had never needed because everyone knew who was in charge just by watching him work. Today, that parking space was about to become evidence in a federal fraud case. I'd been at the plant since 6 a.m., making sure all my documentation was properly organized for the investigators. 15 years of financial records, compliance reports, and audit trails, everything needed to prove that Austin Pemberton had systematically looted $4.7 million from Defense Department accounts while lying about it on federal forms. The first sign of trouble came when Austin's assistant Jennifer started making frantic phone calls. Then Chloe came rushing out of her office, face pale as winter concrete, clutching her phone like it might save her from what was coming. Austin himself didn't appear until 8:47 a.m., strolling in like he owned the world, designer coffee in one hand and his phone in the other. He made it exactly 12 steps inside the building before Agent Hayes intercepted him. Austin Pemberton? That's right, can I help you? Agent Patricia Hayes, DOD Inspector General. We have federal search warrants for these premises and seizure orders for specific financial accounts. I watched Austin's face cycle through confusion, irritation, and finally the first cold touch of fear as Agent Hayes handed him the paperwork. He stood there in his $500 suit, reading legal documents that spelled out exactly how thoroughly he'd destroyed his own life. "This is ridiculous," Austin said, his voice already starting to crack. "There must be some mistake." "No mistake, Mr. Pemberton. We're investigating violations of federal compliance regulations, specifically false certification under Section 302 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act." That's when Austin looked around the room and spotted me. Our eyes met across the shop floor, and I saw the exact moment he realized this wasn't some random audit or bureaucratic mix-up. This was deliberate, this was personal, and this was over. "You did this," he said, pointing at me like I was some kind of traitor instead of the guy who'd been trying to keep him out of federal prison for months. "No, Austin," I replied, walking over to join the conversation. "You did this, I just documented it." Agent Hayes looked between us. "Mr. Crawford, we'll need you to walk us through the financial systems and show us where the relevant documents are stored." "Happy to help, Agent Hayes. I've got everything organized by date and violation type." The next 6 hours were a masterclass in federal investigation efficiency. Agents seized Austin's computer, Chloe's laptop, and every server that contained financial records. They photographed documents, copied hard drives, and interviewed employees who had witnessed Austin's increasingly desperate attempts to move money around like he was playing some kind of corporate shell game. The most beautiful moment came when they found Austin's signed training acknowledgments from 2019, the documents where he'd confirmed understanding that Section 302 violations carried personal criminal liability. Agent Hayes held up the papers like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. "Mr. Pemberton, is this your signature acknowledging personal responsibility for compliance certification accuracy?" Austin's lawyer, who'd arrived around noon looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, put his hand on Austin's shoulder. "Don't answer that." But the damage was already done. The paper trail was complete, the evidence overwhelming, and Austin's future reduced to whatever plea bargain his legal team could negotiate. By 4 p.m., the federal agents had what they needed. Austin's accounts were frozen, his computers confiscated, and his access to company systems terminated. Chloe was facing charges as an accomplice for her role in documenting and distributing evidence of the fraud. The board of directors called an emergency meeting that evening. Austin's father, who'd built this company into a premier defense contractor, sat at the head of the conference table looking like he'd aged 10 years in one day. "Bill," he said, his voice heavy with regret and exhaustion, "I owe you an apology. You tried to warn us, and we didn't listen. Mr. Pemberton, I just did my job. No, you did more than that. You saved this company." 3 months later, the resolution was everything I'd hoped for and more. Austin pleaded guilty to federal fraud charges and got 18 months in prison plus a lifetime ban from defense contractor work. Chloe received probation and community service, along with a very expensive education about the difference between social media marketing and federal evidence. The $4.7 million was recovered with penalties, and Patriot Steel's defense contracts were preserved under new management. The board offered me the permanent CFO position, which I accepted with the understanding that we'd run this company the way Austin's grandfather intended, with integrity, accountability, and respect for the people who built America's defense capabilities. On my first day as CFO, I found a note on my desk from the workers on the shop floor. "Thanks for keeping our jobs safe, Bill. Martha would be proud. She would have been." My wife always said the best revenge wasn't getting even. It was doing the right thing and letting the system handle the rest. Sometimes the old ways are still the best ways. Sometimes experience beats innovation, and sometimes, when entitled kids think they can steal from the Defense Department, all it takes is one old soldier with good records and a long memory to remind them that actions have consequences. The paperwork doesn't lie, and it doesn't forget. Neither do I.